The US this week almost united in condemnation of the parcel bombs, but any truce in the verbal fighting was short-lived.
She hired Hillary Clinton's attorneys to cover it up.
A crowd on Wednesday was still shouting "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton on the day she had been sent one of the devices. The Liberal side criticised the president. CNN said his anti-media tirades created the conditions for this. He fought back in familiar style.
The media also has a responsibility to set a civil tone and to stop the endless hostility and constant negative and oftentimes false attacks and stories. Have to do it.
And again in a tweet last night. To paraphrase, they criticise me, but say I shouldn't criticise them. Basically, violence this week has been just another thing to argue about. The suspect arrested today is perhaps unsurprisingly a Trump supporter.
Trump is that, the next president of the United States.
But he has some history, reports of previous jail, charges for theft and drugs. If he is the man, it would appear that his case couldn't be more different to purposeful or organised violence. It's pure hate. Of course, there have been divided and violent times before. The assassinations of the 60s come to mind, or the protests then that ended in bloody fights. The observation was that violence can be infectious. Which brings us to the UK. Are the conditions here ripe? The language is getting more extreme. This week's inappropriate metaphor is a good example. Do violent words create violent behaviour? And as the court appearance of Tommy Robinson this week showed, the polarisation is extreme.
No matter what happens today, I've already won.
There's rage on both sides. Are these the conditions for the rhetoric to go violent here? Well, on the day that the arrest was made over in the US, we thought we'd stand back and take a look at the danger of violence increasing. This is not to suggest it has ever gone away and may now return. Plenty of people have experienced violence or racism or other forms of hate or are victims of Islamist terror, for example. But should we expect more of this in that liberal, potentially, versus populist domain? Well, I'm joined by Kim Leadbeater, the sister of Jo Cox. She's the chair of More in Common, the charity set up to remember and celebrate Jo's legacy. Matthew Goodwin is author and writer of National Populism, The Revolt Against Liberal Democracies. Holly Turner joins us from Washington, D.C., a Republican strategist who has worked a year in the Trump administration. And from New York, Professor Joanne Freeman is an academic and an expert in American political violence. A very good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start, if I could, with the American experience. So I'll focus on you two, if I might. And Joanne, I wonder if you can, maybe reach back for comparisons. Does this feel like an historic point at which the US is in, or would you say this is, a blip or nothing remarkable?
I would not say it's nothing remarkable. I would say, I suppose, that in some ways it echoes moments from the past. There have been any number of moments, and certainly the 1960s was one of them, when it's very clear that the nation feels like it's shifting course, or that some decision is being made that's going to push the nation in one direction or another. I think those are moments when Americans of all kinds realize that the stakes are high, and it makes politics fraught and polarized and divisive. There have been a number of them throughout American history. It's very clear that we're in another one of these moments, like the 1960s, the 1850s before the Civil War, the late 1790s when the government was first starting. We're at another one of those moments, but it isn't exactly the same. The conditions are different, and part of the difference, I do think, is the particular president who we have now and some of the language he chooses to use.
Joanne, is it the case that violence begets more violence, that it becomes normalised, so one lot do something, then the other lot want to do it, or the language becomes more excitable, and that kind of, if you like, debases the whole process? Should we worry that there's a dynamic here that may lead somewhere?
Well, I think, a certain kind of rhetoric leads to emotion, and that kind of emotion spreads more emotion. I mean, there is a contagion. There's a reason why campaigning rhetoric is so extreme. You're trying to rouse emotion, and you're trying to rouse action in people. So it's supposed to be contagious, and so I do think that that's a risk.
Yeah. Holly, I mean, how seriously should we take this? Because some people have said this week, look, one mad person or bad person in 350 million, let's not get overexcited about it. Where are you on that scale? Because some on the left are saying, hang on a minute, you're trying to to play down the violence on your side.
Absolutely not. I mean, it is a very serious situation, and I think the president has responded appropriately. But I think it's important to look at the situation for what it is. And you know, we talk about, does more violence beget more violence? And I think what you're seeing is, do we need to suppress speech to prevent this type of violence? And I don't think that's the solution here. I think let people feel that they're heard. They've been criticized. We have Hillary Clinton calling people deplorables. We have Democrat congressmen telling people to get up in the face of people that they disagree with. So I think what's going to matter most here and what's going to turn the tide is people are going to feel like when they go and vote that their voice has been heard. And when people feel the freedom to express themselves, then they don't have to resort to violence. But I think also, I mean, the actions of one cannot be contributed to the words of others. And this is a country of personal responsibility, and we cannot blame others for actions that some people take.
But can I just push you a little bit on the language? Because you could be heard, can't you, without using violent language or in any way insinuating that your opponents are out to actually destroy the system or destroy the country. I mean, you can have an opponent without undermining your faith in their legitimacy as a presence in the discourse, can't you?
You can, but I think that the emotions that people are feeling, they should feel free to express those. And, you know, to both sides, I will say to both sides feel very emotional about what is happening, and both sides feel that the other side is going to destroy what they believe in. So it's important to let people express themselves, and obviously violence is not the answer. So we need to be sure we let everyone have a chance to express themselves. And the president has condemned these actions. He has not called for people to behave violently or to take actions. He's asked them to go and vote. He says, if you support what I stand for, then go and vote. And that's the direction that he's given the American people.
Let's come into the debate in the UK. And Kim, I'm fascinated by what you think about violent language, violent metaphors, angry language, and the link to violence.
I think it would be extremely naive to accept that there is no link between a violent narrative and the risk of violent action. And as a family who've been victims of that in the worst possible way, I think it would be wholly unrealistic to not see a connection. I would also not be naive enough to think that, you know, every single person is going to want to take action based on this narrative. That would be wrong. But actually, as we know to our cost, it only takes one person.
Right.
And
it
that's
can be
one
quite
person too many.
An unsettled person or a person with certain flakiness who can really be riled up and...
Yeah, I mean, there are people who have got concerns about our society. There are people who've got concerns about issues in our community, and what we should be doing is trying to understand those concerns and work with them to alleviate those concerns, rather than encouraging those concerns and using language that is potentially going to raise those concerns to a higher level, where the end result could potentially be violence.
When Jo was killed, everyone said we need to change. Have we?
No, unfortunately not. There was a real sense when Jo was murdered, across the political divide, across the political spectrum, things need to change, you know, and there was a huge sense of shock and dismay amongst politicians and amongst the country as a whole. And there was a sense there was a moment there where things would change, and actually, sadly, tragically, I think we're now in an even worse place than we were.
Well, the country is much more divided, isn't it? Matthew, you were right about the divisions, the rise of populism, all the things that have been, to some extent, taking political establishment by surprise over the last few years. Do you see any reason to believe conditions that have led to some violence in the US could lead to more violence here?
Well, we're not as polarised as the US. I'm worried about the state of the US. I mean, just to give you one stat that I find really troubling, more than 90% of Americans now approve of marriage between different racial or ethnic groups, but around 30 to 40% disapprove of the idea of their kids marrying somebody from the other political tribe. Those kinds of stats, to me, are very worrying. Those are the building blocks for something a bit deeper. Could it happen in the UK? I think we've always been different. We have, in the post-war period, had what's called a civic culture. Whether that's going on or not, I think is an open question. But there will always be the isolated loner who seeks to break through. Look at Norway and Breivik, very consensual political culture, but even there you had somebody who felt that he had to take violence in order to get his concerns
onto the agenda. Is there a profile, basically, here? I mean, is it, we don't want to be too simplistic about it all.
There is a profile, and this chap seems to fit that profile. Middle-aged men, typically low-educated, often not connected to civil society.
Quite unsettled and
a history of mental abuse or illness, drug and alcohol problems. In research in Germany, a lot has shown that profile is pretty consistent, and in the UK, obviously, we've seen that profile too. The question is, how do you respond? How do democracies respond to this? And particularly for the US, I would say, how do you prop up that moderate middle and actually push back against this polarisation?
That's a really good question. So, look, let me just go around all four of you and ask, what do you do to lower the temperature, to calm things down? And we'll start with you, Joanne, because you can give us historic examples of where it's been successfully dealt with. Fairly brief all, but Joanne, what should be done, other than just saying, can't we all be nice to each other, which obviously doesn't work?
No, that's not going to work. And I'm going to say something that many others have said and that's sort of beneath the conversation that we're having here. And that is that words matter. They matter profoundly. They inspire emotion. And although you certainly can't blame what we're calling, a loner, one person's actions, the fact of the matter is the words of the President of the United States matter more than other words. That is the elected leader, and I totally agree that this next election and the one after that will be a public choice. The public will have registered what they want, and that matters deeply. But when the President of the United States is saying things that are extreme, and that the sort of person who took action, it inspires that kind of person to take action, that's not optimal. It would be good if the rhetoric, tone down the rhetoric. Don't make it so much of an us and them, they are evil, we are not. That's not a useful way to speak at all, and that's a dangerous way, I think, for a president to
Okay, so
talk.
Holly, I don't know, where would you go, Holly, if you wanted to try and improve the situation? Your president obviously has his way of doing things.
Yeah, I mean, listen, no matter what the president says, the left is going to blame him for things. It doesn't matter what he says. They're always going to say that he is the cause.
Right, so what would you do? So what would you do to improve things?
Listen, people have to understand maybe words do matter, but they are just words. So maybe the better step is to say, hey, let's learn to have discussions and let's learn to have ideas that are different from each other and be okay with that. That's the real problem. When we say words matter, what that says is, well, you can't say anything that is different from what I believe, or else I'm going to be offended and hurt and I might do something bad. The better option is to teach our children and teach in families to have differences of opinion and to be okay with that. That's where the problem is right now. It's not that they're extreme. Yeah, it's that they can't be okay with having differences.
Not taking too much of it.
Exactly.
Let me come to my two British guests. I'll go with you first then, Matthew. I'll give Kim the last word. But what would you do to improve things? You've expressed it as a goal. And
Well, I don't think there's one sort of silver bullet, but the marketplace of ideas, that heart of democracy where we all bring different views and opinions into that marketplace, and we talk and we discuss and we argue, but we bargain and we compromise, that is what is collapsing. So we need to think about what institutions, what mechanisms can we put into place that support that marketplace of ideas. And that means mixing our friendship groups and our social networks. It means having better political leadership. It means starting early at school level and university level and making sure people are exposed to different perspectives. And in cases like this as well, it just means, making sure we're giving security services and police enough resources to do their job, to be frank.
OK, last word, Kim.
I would agree with everything that Matthew said. I would agree with what Joanne said. I would probably slightly disagree with what Holly said. I'm all for freedom of speech. I'm all for freedom of expression. But there is a line. And it's great to debate. It's great to discuss. It's great, that's what politics is about.
But I think
that's what life's about.
Holly thinks her supporters, or the president's supporters have felt like they've been shut down, and so they need they need to be able to express their anger with the system or with the
Absolutely
establishment.
fine, but express it in a civilised manner. Don't express it talking about stabbing and shooting people. That's a totally different narrative to talking about disagreeing with somebody and not, you know, not being on the same page as them politically. So I think, you know, we have an expression in Yorkshire, if you haven't got anything good to say, keep your gob shut. And actually, I think sometimes that there's some truth in that. If you haven't got anything that's going to enhance the debate and move things forward in a positive manner, maybe just don't say anything for a while.
I think that's a good point on which to finish.